Now, this video is going to be a somewhat brief, considering all there is to talk about with this movie, and rather spoiler-free review or overview of the Rise of Skywalker. And I say rather spoiler-free because I'll no doubt say something or talk about something that some might consider borderline spoiler territory. So basically, if you don't want anything at all potentially ruined, maybe don't watch this video until after you've seen it, but just know that I'm not going to be discussing the major plot points or big reveals or anything like that. And also, as promised in the lead up to the movie, I'm going to be as fair and honest as I can be. I'm going to tell you what I really think, and there is both good and bad here, things I liked and things I certainly did not. And I think there are pretty much three ways to look at this movie: as completely its own thing, independent of all the other films, as the conclusion of the sequel trilogy, and as the conclusion of the whole Skywalker saga. And in the first two respects, it kind of works. But as far as the third, as far as a movie that wraps up all three trilogies, it really doesn't work. Overall, this movie is pretty much just a giant mess on many different levels, but there is something in there, something that could have worked if it had a lot more time to tell this story, like another whole movie, or even two, or maybe if the previous movie had set this one up better. And so in one respect, this film has managed to do something I thought would be impossible. It makes me like The Last Jedi even less. Now, why do I say that? Well, because The Rise of Skywalker spends a lot of its time either undoing certain aspects of The Last Jedi or having to manufacture a story because that one didn't leave this one much to work with. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it completely undoes or retcons everything from The Last Jedi, because it does carry some aspects of it forward and plays off of them, mainly and pretty much only the Rey and Kylo Ren stuff. But in a lot of ways, this movie does feel like a sequel to The Force Awakens. It makes The Last Jedi feel like it should have been something radically different in order to align itself better with the two movies it's now sandwiched in between. To be blunt, it makes The Last Jedi feel like a waste of time, and that's not necessarily even meant to be a slight or an insult, it's just a reality. And that wasted time is time this movie desperately needed to tell a story that's otherwise way too ambitious for a little over a 2-hour-long runtime. But it does try to. Boy, does it ever try to be everything you'd ever want out of the conclusion to one of the greatest and most beloved stories of all time. But to try and accomplish a momentous and satisfying ending, it rushes us through the first half of the movie, which really easily could have and should have been its own movie, or been the episode 8 we actually got. And so when you do get to that ending, you almost feel like you've just watched someone do a speed run through a video game, one where every time there's dialogue to set up the story, they're mashing on the button to get through it as fast as they can, even though it's vitally important to understanding the story, and just in order to get to and race through the next bit of action, so that they can get to the next big chunk of quickly delivered dialogue that's vital to the story. And before you know it, you arrive at the end boss battle, and you're left wondering, how did we even get here, and what exactly are the stakes I'm supposed to be caring about? I mean, it's no exaggeration to say that you're just going from one scene to the next at a blistering pace for the first hour or so of the movie, being told what you need to know just to get you to the next scene, where you'll be told even more. And even with as much pure exposition as there is here, there's still a ton of stuff that simply does not get explained at all, and you just kind of gotta go with it. There are also things in here that are so convenient or contrived that in one scene something will be introduced, or someone will have or find something, and then in the very next scene it'll be used to solve a big problem. It really is that bad at times. And a huge problem that goes along with this crazy pace, that they're probably hoping you don't have time to think about or notice, is how fast everyone is moving around the galaxy. Again, I don't want to really give too much away here, but this movie actually takes place in a rather small window of time, yet characters are going across the galaxy multiple times and always manage to get right where they need to be when they need to be there, despite the distances. It's another case of hyperspace travel being as slow or fast as the plot requires, and in this case it feels nearly instantaneous. But maybe the sad part about all of this is that on the rare times that the movie does slow down and just lets the characters and us the audience breathe a little bit, it can be quite good. There are a few really good moments that are mixed in with the chaos and sometimes utter absurdity, and you get the feeling that if this movie didn't have to spend so much time on setting everything up, that it actually could have worked. These characters would have felt like actual characters, not pieces rapidly being moved across a board and into their next needed position before ultimately reaching the goal. And going into this movie, we were told we'd get more backstory for both Finn and Poe, but what that actually amounted to was like a 2-minute scene for each of them where again, this story slows down just a touch and lets the characters have a moment. Though that said, one of the best parts of the movie was the banter between the main characters, and mainly between Finn and Poe, though Rey felt like part of the group as well. You actually do feel camaraderie here. And C-3PO was part of that as well, and he was actually great in this movie, I thought. One of the highlights even. And though we may not have seen them all working together much on screen previously, you did get the sense that it had happened somewhere and at some time. You kind of wish you had seen it. And speaking of Rey, I thought she was handled rather well in this movie, or at least much better than she was in The Last Jedi. There is certainly a solid attempt to humanize her character, though don't get me wrong, she still has her moments where you watch her and go, okay, that was pretty crazy. Though at the same time, she does take her lumps in this movie. She does make mistakes and shows a little bit of self-doubt, actually. And I hate to harp on this, but this really is more what she should have been in The Last Jedi. And moving on from that, one thing that, regretfully, I didn't feel worked that well was the inclusion of Leia. Though at the same time, I think the movie, for what it's worth, needed her, and I don't think they made the wrong decision to include her, per se. Problem is, her scenes, to me, were a bit jarring. You could certainly tell they were working with what they had, and the way she delivers her lines doesn't really fit with the mood of the scene, if that makes sense. There's also one scene where you really do get the impression they had some footage of her left that they didn't know what to do with or had a place for, but decided to use it just because, and it comes off as very awkward. Again, I think they made the right call to use what they had of Carrie Fisher, and I'll gladly take Leia in this movie over not having her at all, even if it is a bit off. Another thing that, again, regretfully, wasn't the greatest was the soundtrack. Well, let me rephrase that. I loved hearing all the music again from the original trilogy, and a lot of it gets used, and I do mean a lot, but nothing new stood out to me at all. Rey and Kylo's theme are, no surprise, very prevalent, and they kind of morph as the movie goes on, which I thought was clever and I enjoyed, but sadly, there was no completely new piece that stood out to me. John Williams will always be the master, and in a lot of ways this movie celebrated him and his work. He even makes a cameo in the film, but this was not his finest original work, more like a greatest hits remastered. As for the big new characters like Zori Bliss and Jannah, well, they kind of end up feeling like a good story for another time, perhaps. I didn't dislike them, and there's potential there, but considering how little time there was for some of the more main characters to take center stage, neither one of them really got much of a chance to shine, but they were certainly fine in the little time they did get. Any of the other new characters you may have heard about, short of Allegiant General Pride perhaps, are almost inconsequential, and Rose's role in this movie is also very small. Lando's role is also small, but it was just great to see him. A shame they waited this long to bring him in, and we never got to see him and Han together on the screen. Okay, so to kind of start wrapping this up, and I'll have a lot more to say in my spoiler review and no doubt many other videos to come, in terms of just a movie in itself and in terms of the end of the sequel trilogy, I don't hate this movie at all. If I can compartmentalize it as just those two things and forget all about the bigger picture, which isn't easy, I think it's fine, and a lot of people are probably going to like it, despite it being an utter and absolute mess at times, and having other problems that are hard to get into without treading into spoiler territory. I think especially more casual fans are really going to like it, or those who don't know or care much about the overall lore and just go to a Star Wars movie to be entertained and don't think too much about it afterwards. Those are the fans I feel this movie was made for, despite the fact that some, especially some critics, seem to think that this is going to appeal to and appease the more hardcore fans with all the fan service. And the people or critics who say that really don't understand hardcore fans, I feel. Just like they didn't understand why some hardcore fans didn't like The Last Jedi. Anyway here, as for this movie being the end of the Skywalker saga, in that department, this movie is a total letdown for me, as is the whole sequel trilogy. There's really no point in it existing, other than to make money for Disney, of course. It doesn't actually further the story of Star Wars one bit, and that's the biggest shame of all. It exists just for the sake of continuing the story, and by and large, we're back at the very same place we were when Return of the Jedi ended, and we learned nothing significant along the way. In fact, and this one might move into spoiler territory a bit too much for some, so either turn your volume down for a moment or two until I take the spoiler warning off the screen, or just skip ahead 30 seconds, or just click away altogether at this point. I'm almost done. But the only real way this movie tries to give us a more definitive end to the saga than Return of the Jedi did is to imply that, this time, it's all of the Sith of the past against all of the Jedi of the past. That is literally it. And if you wanted some grand explanation for anything and everything that's happening in this movie, you're out of luck. That's all glossed over, and I can only imagine the other sources of canon will be building around this movie for years and years to come in order for it to make total sense. So in closing, I want to say that J.J. Abrams tried to do the best he could with what he had to work with, in terms of finishing the sequel trilogy at least. But in terms of closing out the whole saga, Palpatine coming back is basically what's supposed to cover that whole department, with a little more actual thought put into it than that. There are also some things in this movie that you maybe had small shreds of hope for, like Sith troopers for example, but they turn out to be irrelevant. There's also many other things, like the giant fleet of Star Destroyers that you see in the trailers and commercials, that I really hope you didn't want to get answers to, like who built them and how, where did all the resources and manpower come from, and so on. But if you can overlook all of that, and don't mind a movie that moves at a blistering pace most of the time, and the overall lore isn't all that important to you, you're probably going to love The Rise of Skywalker. Others may simply accept it as a fitting end to the sequel trilogy, but little more. And others still are going to hate everything about this movie. As for me, I don't hate it for what it is, but I do feel let down that I waited my whole life to see the sequels to the original trilogy, and this is what they turned out to be. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments and tell me what you thought of this movie, or if you plan on seeing it or not. In the next day or two, I'll probably have a deep dive spoiler review video up, which will discuss more of the lore aspects, as well as more of the finer details of the film that would otherwise be spoilers. And it's going to be a hell of a dissection, to put it mildly. For now, though, leave those comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thank you ever so much for watching.